The palace was quiet, but not peaceful. The echo of boots on marble seemed louder than usual, reverberating through hallways that had witnessed centuries of loyalty, ceremony, and unspoken tension. Outside, the morning sun gilded the stone walls, yet inside, the air was heavy with expectation, an invisible weight pressing on every shoulder, every glance, every measured step. Camilla moved with quiet authority, her presence commanding without a word, yet every gesture spoke volumes. She issued a command, subtle and deliberate, but unprecedented, a challenge to the authority of Princess Charlotte. The young princess, poised and aware, felt the delicate balance of duty tremble beneath her. Around them, the royal guard froze, caught between centuries of protocol and the audacity of modern ambition. In that suspended moment, every glance, every breath became a negotiation of loyalty. The portraits lining the walls, stern monarchs and long-gone generals, seemed to watch silently, their painted eyes weighing each decision. The palace itself held its breath, aware that what happened here would ripple through history. And somewhere in the shadows, whispers hinted at secrets hidden deep in the royal archives. Secrets that could explain why a single, audacious command might threaten the very crown itself. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that command still hung in the air. Footsteps had stopped mid-stride, whispers of protocol frozen on trembling lips. Outside the palace gates, the first light of dawn stretched across the cobblestones, gilding the ancient walls in pale gold. Yet inside, a storm of uncertainty brewed, invisible to all but those who understood the weight of tradition. For centuries, the royal guard had moved as one, each motion rehearsed, each glance calculated, each breath measured in service of the crown. And yet, today, centuries of discipline were being tested, not by foreign threat or rebellion, but by a single, unanticipated command from Camilla, a command that dared to defy the authority of Princess Charlotte. Camilla's words had been soft, almost casual, yet carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "Ensure the arrangement proceed as I instructed," she had said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Yet the phrasing bore a subtle imperfection, a pause in syllables, a hesitation that only trained eyes would notice. The seasoned guard nearest her recognized the significance immediately. This was a test. Every observer, from the highest-ranking officer to the newest recruit, understood the stakes. Here, history and protocol collided with personal ambition, and the consequences, though not yet visible, promised to ripple outward like a stone cast upon still water. Princess Charlotte, poised yet undeniably young, stood near the grand staircase. Her eyes met those of the head guard, a silent appeal for loyalty, for guidance, for the unflinching protection of traditions that defined her world. Every gesture she made, tilted chin, steadying hand upon the balustrade, subtle shift in posture, was a silent argument for order, for the continuity of heritage. And yet, across from her, Camilla exuded a quiet defiance, a controlled certainty that bent without breaking the rules, testing the limits of obedience. The echo of boots on marble was not just sound, it was discipline made audible. Each step forward, each turn of a wrist, each tilt of a head resonated with history. The guard nearest Camilla hesitated. The leather-bound protocol manual lay open on a side table, yet offered no guidance for what was unfolding. There was no precedent for defiance cloaked as instruction. No law, no tradition, no code provided an answer when ambition and duty collided in the shadowed halls of royalty. A flicker of tension crossed the faces of the onlookers. The youngest guard bit his lip, fingers clenching the ceremonial halberd as if it were a lifeline. He knew that action, or inaction, could redefine the narrative of loyalty forever. A senior officer exhaled sharply, careful not to betray concern, and adjusted the angle of his stance, recalibrating the invisible balance of power. Every eye was drawn to the subtle gestures, the lift of Camilla's brow, the slow exhalation of the princess, the shuffle of feet against stone floors. These gestures were not theatrics. They were the language of control, of authority, of risk. Hours felt like minutes. Each second carried its own moral weight. The palace, ancient and enduring, seemed to hold its breath, walls steeped in the secrets of centuries of royal obedience. The portraits lining the hall, stern monarchs, long-deceased generals, watchful ancestors, appeared to observe, silent witnesses to a moment challenging everything they once defended. A chandelier swayed slightly above, scattering fractured rainbows across the marble floor, as if the room itself were uncertain where loyalty lay. Camilla stepped forward. Just a fraction, enough emotion to be noted but not yet answered. Her eyes, calculating and calm, flicked to the head guard. He met her gaze without flinching, yet inside, a storm raged. The moral question was immediate. Obey the unspoken demands of ambition, or defend centuries of ceremonial law and the authority of a princess whose right to command was unquestioned yet fragile in the face of audacity. Do you not see the implications? One guard murmured, voice low. It was not a question, but acknowledgement. To follow Camilla's instruction would set precedent. To defy it would uphold duty at personal cost. The audience feels the tension tighten, like a drawn bowstring, ready to release. A letter, slipped onto a desk by an unseen hand, fluttered in a slight breeze. Its contents were irrelevant, yet the gesture underscored the unseen pressures threading through the palace walls. Every command, every glance, every heartbeat was a negotiation between obedience and conscience, between ambition and loyalty. Princess Charlotte finally moved, just a slight adjustment, signaling her presence, her awareness, her rightful place. The guard nearest her straightened, shoulders squared, as if the motion imbued him with courage. Camilla watched, unflinching, and the room collectively inhaled. The unspoken command hung in balance, unresolved yet decisive in effect. Outside, the sun climbed higher, piercing the windows with bright shafts of light, highlighting dust motes suspended in the air, a silent testament to centuries of history now confronted with modern ambition. Shadows stretched deeper, emphasizing the distance between right and expedience, ceremonial obedience and the audacity of personal will. Minutes stretched into eternity. The camera moved across polished floors, reflecting the faces of those who must act. The moral tension was tangible. The decision lay not in words, but in the pause before gesture, the hesitation before compliance, the unspoken promise of action deferred or denied. The palace was alive, though the activity was minimal. The weight of tradition pressed on every shoulder, shaping the trajectory of this confrontation. And then, almost imperceptibly, the first shift occurred. A hand rose, not yet in defiance, but in acknowledgement that the rules were being questioned. Eyes darted, muscles tensed, breath caught. Camilla noticed, tilted her head, and a tiny, knowing smile crossed her face. She had tested boundaries, and the palace responded. In this suspended moment, the stakes were clear. Not just protocol, not just duty, but legacy itself was at risk. The royal guard, embodiment of centuries of loyalty, stood at a crossroads. Their decision would ripple through history, unseen by the public yet seismically altering the narrative of monarchy, ambition, and tradition. A whispered conversation in the corner hinted at secrets buried deep within the palace archives. Something unseen yet consequential. Something that could explain Camilla's audacity, her confidence, her willingness to challenge the authority of a princess not yet 20. The shadows suggested hidden corridors, hidden truths, hidden betrayals. The tension did not dissipate. It transformed. Every subtle glance, every measured breath, every shift of weight communicated the unspoken language of power. The line between loyalty and ambition was not merely blurred. It had become the battlefield upon which the crown's integrity would be tested. The palace was quieter now, but the weight of what transpired lingered like a low hum beneath the walls. Camilla's audacious command had passed, yet no resolution had come. The echo of hesitation, of centuries of protocol threatened, still vibrated through the corridors. Guards shifted nervously, exchanging glances laden with unspoken questions, their eyes tracing the stone arches, the gilded frames, the long corridors that had seen generations bend and break under pressure far less complex than this. Princess Charlotte remained poised, yet behind composure, a subtle tension threaded her movements. She understood the necessity of calm, the veneer of ceremonial grace. But inside, a storm brewed. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every almost imperceptible tremor of the hand that held her ceremonial gloves reminded her that authority was as fragile as it was sacred. And now, in the aftermath of Camilla's defiance, every small detail mattered. every gesture, every precedent, every shadow in the hall. The senior guard, a man whose tenure spanned decades, whose memory of protocol rivaled the palace archive themselves, moved with purpose. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors with measured steps, eyes scanning open ledgers, ceremonial manuals, and private correspondence left in careful anonymity. Each document, each note, each diary entry became a piece of a puzzle, evidence of subtle but persistent pattern. Camilla's interventions, previously dismissed as isolated or benign, revealed themselves as a calculated dance at the edge of authority. The hierarchy of the royal guard was not merely structural. It was moral, cultural, almost spiritual. Each rank carried implicit responsibility, each uniform a covenant with history. The senior guard examined the codices detailing the ceremonial codes, the precise angle at which a halberd should be held, the timing of salute, the order in which steps must follow in procession. Every detail existed to preserve continuity and prevent chaos. And yet, he realized, rules alone were powerless against ambition wielded with subtlety. Camilla's command had skirted the letter of the law while violating its spirit, exposing a fault line in the palace's rigid discipline. The camera drifts along the shadowed corridors, revealing hidden alcoves where correspondence had been tucked away over decades. Yellowed letters bound in ribbon or sealed with wax hinted at alliances and rivalries invisible to the public eye. Diaries of past courtiers, private records of forgotten ceremonies, even casual notes on menu arrangements and seating orders were now invaluable evidence of the patterns Camilla had long been cultivating. Her interventions were not impulsive. They were deliberate. Each minor breach of tradition, each careful deviation from protocol, traced a line toward influence, toward subtle usurpation. As the senior guard moved, he found confirmation of what he'd suspected. Small but significant breaches scattered through the archives. Meetings convened without notice. Instructions given without approval. Ceremonial roles subtly reassigned. All executed with the precision of someone who understood the weight of appearance, who knew how to bend the rules without appearing to break them. Each breach alone might have been dismissed, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet rebellion in the corridors of tradition. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte observed from a distance, absorbing the rhythm of palace life, as she always had. She knew the way of the crown, even before she was meant to wear it fully, was not merely political or public. It was embedded in ritual, codified in practice, and preserved by the unflinching vigilance of those sworn to protect it. Her eyes traced the motions of the guards, the precise choreography of ceremonial gestures, the subtle corrections passed in silence from mentor to pupil. Every motion told a story, every hesitation revealed loyalty, and every deviation suggested influence. The palace archives themselves became an unlikely theater of intrigue. A folded note slipped behind a ledger spoke of a private audience with Camilla weeks prior, a conversation recorded only in shorthand by a trusted aide. The words, carefully chosen, carried implications beyond mere etiquette. An assertion of authority, a subtle challenge to prerogative of the princess, a testing of the guard's discipline. The senior officer read between the lines, understanding not merely what was said but what was implied. He realized that history and ambition were intertwined, that even centuries-old traditions could be nudged, tested, and manipulated by those who knew their way through the shadows. Every corridor echoed with the weight of protocol. Guards whispered only when necessary, and when they did, their voices carried a cadence of measured discretion. One spoke softly of minor missteps observed during a recent procession, hands lifted when they should have rested, salutes mistimed, ceremonial spacing ever so slightly altered. On the surface, trivialities. Beneath, potential catalysts for confrontation. Every gesture could be interpreted as allegiance or defiance, and in this delicate environment, the line between loyalty and insubordination was razor thin. The palace itself seemed to respond to the unfolding tension. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting fractured mosaics across polished floors, shadows stretching in patterns that almost seemed intentional. The walls, lined with ancestral portraits and ceremonial relics, bore witness to every nuance, every decision, every unspoken conversation. The palace had seen crises before, political disputes, scandals, threats to succession, but the quiet, calculated subversion of protocol was a rare and dangerous challenge, one that demanded both vigilance and courage. In hushed moments, the senior guard reflected on Camilla's previous behavior. Each small breach, each unnoticed infraction, now revealed itself as part of a broader strategy. There was precision in her deviations, a subtle orchestration that manipulated perception while preserving deniability. She did not confront authority openly. She undermined it quietly, creating situations in which loyalty and conscience collided, forcing the guards to navigate impossible choices. The narrative deepened as the senior guard discovered letters from past attendants, diaries noting the precise cadence of ceremonial adjustments, even memos documenting off-the-record instructions from previous royal observers. These artifacts revealed patterns that no rulebook could fully account for, personalities influencing procedures, ambitions subtly bending tradition, small acts that, over time, shaped the hierarchy. Camilla was not the first to test these limits, but she understood the game more fully than most. Hours passed in quiet observation. Guards performed their duties with meticulous care, yet tension was palpable. Each movement was scrutinized, each glance measured. Even the youngest recruit sensed the potential consequences. Protocol was no longer an abstract concept. It was a battlefield of morality, loyalty, and discernment. Every footstep, every bow, every gesture was loaded with significance, a silent testament to the weight of history pressing on the present. Then came the subtle misstep. A hand raised when it should not have been, a gesture out of sequence, a brief hesitation in salutation. It was almost imperceptible, yet it carried seismic implications. The guards collectively registered it, the senior officer first and most decisively. It was a moment of choice. Adhere to the chain of command unquestioningly, or recognize that loyalty sometimes demanded action beyond obedience. The palace held its breath once more, a silent witness to a decision that would shape the unfolding drama. The misstep confirmed what had been feared. Confrontation was inevitable. Camilla's intentions were clear, and the palace's rigid traditions left no room for ambiguity. The royal guard stood at a moral crossroads, charged not merely with ceremonial duty, but with protecting the integrity of the crown itself. Every minute detail, every historical precedent, every archive note would now guide their response. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were immediate, tangible, and profoundly consequential. As the day wore on, the corridors became alive with calculated observation. Guards moved with precision, observing both Camilla and Princess Charlotte, noting gestures, timing, and interactions. Each silent exchange, each glance, each subtle nod was recorded mentally, a map of loyalty and risk forming in real time. Camilla's every move was deliberate, a test of discipline and morality, and the guards knew that how they responded would not only define the moment but echo through history. By the late afternoon, the palace archives had yielded a clearer picture. Correspondences spanning decades suggested an underlying strategy, a pattern of influence designed to test and, perhaps, bend the institution without shattering it outright. Camilla's audacity was neither reckless nor impulsive. It was calculated, informed by precedent, yet daring enough to create moral dilemmas for those sworn to uphold tradition. The audience could now understand the gravity. Loyalty was being tested, and history itself seemed to lean toward judgment. The shadows in the halls deepened as evening approached. Candles flickered, casting long, uncertain forms against polished floors. Guards whispered only in essential words, and every instruction carried more weight than it had in decades. The palace, ancient and enduring, had become a stage where past, present, and ambition collided. The audience understood that the coming confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The royal guard would have to choose tradition, conscience, or compromise. The grand hall was tense, a cathedral of authority and history, every inch imbued with centuries of ritual. The chandeliers hung like suspended orbs of expectation, their crystals catching the light and fracturing it across polished floors. Princess Charlotte stood at the far end, posture precise, eyes sharp, every muscle coiled with both vigilance and the weight of inherited responsibility. Around her, the royal guard moved with disciplined subtlety, a living wall of protocol, each member silently evaluating, calculating, ready to act, but waiting for the right moment. Camilla entered with measured grace, a presence that commanded attention without raising her voice. Her movements were deliberate, Her gaze swept the room as if she were both observer and judge. Every subtle step was designed to unsettle, to assert, to test. The air seemed to thicken around her, a quiet tension that even the ornate tapestries could not absorb. The audience could sense the moral stakes. This was no ordinary encounter. Every gesture had consequence. Every word carried authority, and every silent pause demanded interpretation. The senior guard advanced, breaking the taut silence just enough to remind all present that protocol, though challenged, still held sway. "Your Grace," he began, voice firm yet restrained. "Orders must align with established ceremonial precedents." His words were precise, weighted, and deliberate. Camilla tilted her head, a faint smile touching her lips, as if acknowledging both his authority and her intention to subtly override it. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension almost tactile. Princess Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, though her composure remained unbroken. She understood the subtle mechanics of power. Obedience could be demanded, but respect had to be earned. Camilla's command, though softly spoken, had challenged not just her authority, but the very principles upon which the royal guard's loyalty rested. Every guard knew the implications. To follow would be to compromise centuries of tradition, to resist risk confrontation and public scrutiny alike. The first ripple of confrontation emerged as Camilla spoke again, her tone casual but resolute. "Ensure the arrangements proceed as I directed," she said, and though the word were simple, the meaning was layered. A test of loyalty, a challenge of procedure, a deliberate provocation. The guard shifted minutely, invisible to the untrained eye, yet each movement was a silent acknowledgement of choice and responsibility. The hall, despite its grandeur, felt smaller somehow, compressed by the gravity of unspoken decision-making. For a moment, silence reigned. Even the chandeliers seemed to pause in their gentle sway, as if the palace itself were holding judgment. The audience, immersed in the unfolding drama, could almost feel the centuries of discipline pressing down, the invisible weight of loyalty that bound each individual to history. The senior guard's hand hovered over ceremonial protocol manuals, the pages open but insufficient, unable to dictate action in this unprecedented moment. Then, the first crack appeared. A junior guard stepped forward, hesitating, unsure whether to act or remain passive. His eyes met Princess Charlotte's for a fleeting instant, a silent exchange, a question of authority, a test of conscience. Camilla's gaze followed, calculating, deliberate, watching the smallest movement, the tiniest shift, reading not just obedience but intent. It was a psychological battlefield, a clash between tradition and ambition, with the crown's integrity hanging in balance. Princess Charlotte finally spoke, voice calm but unyielding. "Orders must follow protocol," she stated. Her words were measured, deliberate, leaving no ambiguity. The senior guard nodded imperceptibly, signaling the beginning of a silent alignment. The royal guard's loyalty was to tradition first, to personal ambition second. Camilla's expression remained unreadable, a mask of civility concealing subtle frustration and calculation. The confrontation escalated with every gesture. Camilla moved closer, a mere step, yet it reverberated through the hall. Guards instinctively adjusted their positions, hands brushing ceremonial weapons, eyes flicking to corners and exits. The atmosphere was electric, silent, yet crackling with anticipation. The audience could feel the moral tension, the stakes elevated by the unspoken consequences of a single act. Then revelations emerged. Letters and private correspondences, previously hidden, were subtly introduced by the senior guard, not in accusation, but in demonstration. They hinted at motives, alliances, and betrayals, illuminating the calculated pattern of Camilla's actions. The words on the parchment were not merely notes. They were evidence of intent, a quiet strategy that had tested loyalty repeatedly, preparing the stage for this confrontation. Princess Charlotte absorbed each detail, her eyes scanning not just the text, but the subtle reactions of the guards, the micro-expressions of those present, the shifts in posture and tension. Every element mattered. Every small detail was a thread in a larger tapestry of authority, influence, and duty. Camilla, recognizing the scrutiny, remained composed, though a slight tightening of her jaw revealed the faintest crack in her serene facade. The audience felt the tension rise as the moral crossroads became evident. Camilla's command had been more than an assertion of authority. It threatened the very integrity of the crown's lineage, the unbroken chain of duty that had safeguarded history. The royal guard, embodiment of centuries of loyalty, faced a choice not merely of compliance, but of conscience. Their actions now would define the limits of obedience, the meaning of duty, and the boundaries of personal ambition. A subtle motion, a hand adjusting a ceremonial sash, a shift in stance, marked the turning point. The guard nearest Camilla stepped forward not aggressively, but decisively, a gesture signaling that tradition will hold. The hall seemed to exhale collectively. The tension momentarily crystallized into action. The audience understood that in this instant, loyalty had been tested, morality had been measured, and authority had been reaffirmed without a single word of confrontation. Camilla's eyes narrowed fractionally, recognizing the inevitability of what was unfolding. Her strategy had been meticulous, but the collective discipline of the royal guard proved resilient. Even the most subtle deviations from protocol could not displace centuries of cultivated loyalty. Yet the confrontation had not ended. It had transformed. The moral question remained. Could ambition coexist with tradition, or must one always yield to the other? Princess Charlotte's composure never wavered. Her gaze swept the hall, acknowledging the silent support of her guards, the unseen loyalty of those who had measured action against conscience, the quiet understanding that authority demanded both respect and defense. The crown itself, in this moment, felt less like an ornament and more like a living symbol of history, expectation, and moral responsibility. Camilla finally withdrew a step, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. The audience sensed a subtle defeat, the quiet recalibration of power. The royal guard's choice had frozen the room, an unspoken declaration that tradition, discipline, and loyalty were not to be manipulated by personal ambition. However carefully it was executed, the emotional resonance lingered. Silence, now layered with relief and tension alike, stretched across the hall. The audience understood the full scope of the confrontation. Authority had been challenged, history had been invoked, and the crown itself had been defended without violence or scandal. Yet the moral implications persisted. The line between obedience and conscience, tradition and ambition, had been tested and clearly defined for all who witnessed it. The senior guard stepped aside, eyes flicking to the corners of the hall, noting small expressions of fear, admiration, and relief. Each guard processed the moment differently, internalizing the lesson that the integrity of the crown demanded both courage and discernment. Princess Charlotte, standing tall yet mindful of the weight she bore, observed the subtle shifts, understanding that this confrontation would echo through every future decision, every ceremonial act, and every silent measure of loyalty. The camera lingered on the smallest details, the glint of ceremonial armor catching the light, the precise alignment of polished shoes, the flicker of emotion across faces trained to hide it. These details, seemingly minor, became the emotional markers of the confrontation, the silent record of a battle fought in shadows, gestures, and moral judgment rather than swords or speech. The room settled, yet the moral tension remained palpable. Camilla's retreat was not surrender. It was acknowledgement that her ambition had met the immovable force of tradition. The royal guard had acted decisively, preserving the integrity of centuries-old customs, while navigating a landscape fraught with personal ambition and subtle manipulation. The crown, in all its symbolic weight, remained intact. The grand hall, once alive with disciplined tension, now lay in a hushed stillness, thick with the residue of confrontation. The chandeliers cast soft, uneven light over marble floors, their crystals fracturing it into fragmented patterns that mirrored the fractured loyalties now quietly reverberating through the palace. Princess Charlotte remained poised, yet the subtle tension in her shoulders betrayed the enormity of what had transpired. She had seen authority challenged, tradition tested, and the royal guard forced to navigate a delicate moral and ceremonial crossroads. Camilla, meanwhile, withdrew to the shadows near a towering column, her posture controlled, her expression unreadable. Yet beneath the calm veneer, a flicker of uncertainty surfaced, brief, almost imperceptible, but telling. For the first time, she confronted the consequences of her audacity. The awareness that her carefully orchestrated challenge had been met with unyielding loyalty, that centuries of protocol were not so easily bent by ambition alone. Every subtle glance she cast, every adjustment of her attire, was measured, as if she were negotiating her place not just in the room, but in history itself. The royal guard, still aligned, move with precision, but their minds wrestle with the moral weight of the day. Silent conversations, almost imperceptible to anyone untrained in observation, flitted between them, eyes meeting across the hall, the slightest nods, shifts in stance, all conveying approval, caution, or concern. The palace walls, steeped in centuries of discipline, seemed to hum with the echoes of decisions made and deferred, whispering reminders that loyalty demanded discernment as much as obedience. Hidden within the recesses of the palace, archival rooms and private chambers began to reveal truths long buried. Letters, carefully preserved in faded ink, chronicled patterns of subtle influence, minor deviations from ceremonial norms, and discreet suggestions made over decades by those who had understood how ambition could operate quietly within rigid structures. Each document revealed the underlying strategies employed by Camilla, not recklessly, but with deliberate, almost surgical precision. The audience now recognized that what had unfolded was not a momentary lapse, but a carefully cultivated pattern of testing the boundaries of authority. The young princess absorbed these revelations in silence, her eyes scanning every note, every folded paper, every annotation in the margins. Her mind traced the paths of influence, identifying patterns of manipulation, and understanding the delicate interplay between loyalty and conscience. She realized that the royal guard had acted not only to preserve protocol, but to safeguard history itself. Each choice, each gesture of restraint or enforcement, was part of a larger moral calculus that defined the very meaning of duty within the palace. Camilla, sensing scrutiny, maintained her controlled demeanor, but moments of introspection revealed the cost of her ambition. The psychological toll was subtle yet profound. The act of challenging authority, even with careful calculation, required constant vigilance, a relentless awareness of perception, and an acute understanding of the historical weight pressing upon every decision. Her retreat into shadowed corners and quiet observation was not defeat, but strategic pause, a recalibration of influence, measured against the resilient force of tradition and the unwavering vigilance of the royal guard. The senior guard, having observed both the confrontation and its immediate aftermath, reflected on the subtle betrayals embedded within these interactions. Betrayal, in this context, was rarely overt. It was whispered, implied, and often hidden behind gestures of civility. Yet its consequences were immediate and tangible. Trust had been tested, loyalties measured, and moral boundaries clarified. Each guard internalized the lesson differently, aware that adherence to tradition demanded not only discipline, but insight, courage, and judgment. The palace itself became a mirror for the internal struggle unfolding. Shadows lengthened along polished floors, dancing in fractured patterns that mirrored the moral ambiguity of the day. The tapestries and portraits lining the walls seemed to record each silent exchange, each hesitation, each unspoken judgment. These witnesses, silent and eternal, reminded all present that history is not only written in grand gestures, but also in quiet acts of conscience, in choices made when the world is watching and when it is not. Within the private chambers, letters and ceremonial objects revealed further context. A ceremonial tiara, once the centerpiece of a minor procession, now symbolized a delicate balance between authority and influence. Letters accompanying it chronicled decades of advisory interventions, quiet realignments of protocol, and minor infractions that, cumulatively, had tested the very limits of the royal guard's obedience. The audience could now see the continuum of influence. Camilla's actions were the latest chapter in a long, shadowed history of subtle challenge and cautious preservation. Whispers echoed softly through the corridors. Guards exchanged observations, voices low, careful not to betray concern yet striving to understand the broader implications. One guard remarked quietly about a previous misalignment in a ceremonial procession. Another recalled a subtle reassignment of duties that had caused unease. These observations, trivial in isolation, form a mosaic of insight, revealing the depth of planning and foresight behind Camilla's challenge. Princess Charlotte, absorbing both archival evidence and the behaviors of those around her, confronted the moral dimension of authority. She realized that loyalty was not a blind adherence to command, but a dynamic negotiation between obedience, ethics, and the preservation of history. Each guard decision, Each subtle gesture of support or restraint reflected this understanding. In this moment, she was not only a witness, but a participant in the preservation of institutional integrity. Her authority affirmed not by words alone, but by the moral courage of those who surrounded her. The audience could feel the tension shift as Camilla's initial confidence gave way to reflection. Her challenge, though executed with precision and subtlety, had exposed vulnerabilities in both herself and the institution she sought to influence. The royal guard had responded not with reactionary force, but with measured, principled action, reinforcing the moral and ceremonial foundations upon which the crown depended. Hours passed in quiet analysis. Guards reviewed protocols, examined correspondence, and reflected on the consequences of the confrontation. Every detail mattered. The timing of a salute, the position of a ceremonial weapon, the subtle alignment of procession order. These seemingly minute factors, now imbued with heightened significance, underscore the interplay between ambition, tradition, and moral responsibility. The palace itself seemed to breathe with the accumulated weight of these considerations, aware that history had been observed, measured, and judged. Camilla, while outwardly composed, began subtle adjustments, checking documents, observing interactions, noting responses. Every micro-gesture was informed by both ambition and caution, a recognition that the royal guard's unwavering loyalty had imposed boundaries on her influence. The audience could perceive the psychological impact, the constant negotiation between desire for authority and the immutable weight of protocol, a tension that would not easily abate. The young princess, meanwhile, internalized lessons not immediately visible to those outside the hall. She noted who had hesitated, who had acted decisively, and who had remained in the shadows. Each observation was a record of loyalty and discernment, a preparation for future responsibilities. In the quiet aftermath, she realized that leadership required both observation and judgment, courage tempered by restraint, and authority exercised with wisdom and moral clarity. A hidden envelope discovered in a side alcove revealed further secrets, letters from previous royal advisors, annotations of ceremonial adjustments, and even minor complaints about deviations in protocol. These documents painted a portrait of an institution both resilient and vulnerable, capable of enduring challenges yet susceptible to quiet manipulation. Camilla's recent actions were now contextualized as part of a broader narrative, demonstrating not recklessness, but calculated testing of limits. As evening fell, the shadows lengthened, enveloping the hall in muted tones of amber and gray. Guards whispered low, discussing patterns and precedents, evaluating choices and consequences. Each small exchange reinforced the gravity of duty, the fragility of authority, and the subtle balance between ambition and loyalty. The audience, immersed in the scene, could sense the moral and psychological tension that now defined the palace. Princess Charlotte walked slowly through the corridors, her presence both ceremonial and contemplative. She observed small details, a misplaced document, a hesitant gesture, a furtive glance, all reinforcing the understanding that loyalty required discernment, and that authority demanded both courage and vigilance. Camilla, from her vantage in the shadows, watched as well, calculating the implications of each observation, each subtle reaction, each small, silent act of moral affirmation by the royal guard. The hall, though calm, remained thick with unresolved tension. Betrayal, ambition, and duty had collided, leaving an emotional imprint on every surface, every observer, and every participant. The audience understood the scope. This was not merely a test of obedience, but a moral reckoning, a confrontation with the subtle ethics of authority, and an exploration of the human cost of upholding tradition. The palace was quieter than it had been in weeks, yet the quiet carried a weight far heavier than silence alone could bear. The echoes of confrontation still lingered, not in the hallways, not in the corridors, but in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Every guard, every attendant, every observer felt the imprint of that pivotal moment, a challenge to authority, a test of conscience, and a reaffirmation of centuries-old tradition. The moral equilibrium of the palace had been restored, but not without the awareness that loyalty was a burden as much as a virtue. Princess Charlotte moved deliberately to the grand hall, her footsteps echoing softly over polished marble. Her gaze swept across the ceremonial banners, the gilded portraits, the chandeliers that had witnessed generations of monarchy, and she understood in a profound, almost physical way that leadership was more than position. It was a responsibility that required both courage and vigilance. The royal guard flanked her silently, each man and woman a testament to the unwavering discipline that had preserved the crown across centuries. Their expressions were measured, controlled, but behind the calm lay a collective understanding. The palace had been tested, and tradition had endured. Camilla remained in the shadows, her posture carefully composed, yet her eyes betrayed a quiet reckoning. The consequences of her actions were evident, not in recrimination, but in acknowledgement. She had tested the boundaries of authority, and in doing so it revealed both her ambition and the steadfast resolve of those sworn to uphold the crown. The subtle tension between personal desire and institutional integrity had been illuminated, leaving no room for ambiguity. The audience could sense the delicate moral balance at play. Authority maintained not through intimidation, but through disciplined, principled action. The royal guard moved with precision, executing ceremonial duties with the calm exactitude expected of them, yet every gesture carried additional weight. A hand placed upon the hilt of a ceremonial sword, a measured step in procession, a silent adjustment of posture. All spoke of vigilance maintained not for spectacle, but for principle. Each motion was a reaffirmation of loyalty, a quiet assertion that tradition could withstand challenge, and that the moral fabric of the institution remained intact. Princess Charlotte approached the center of the hall, where the crown rested on its velvet cushion, bathed in a shaft of afternoon light. The symbolism was undeniable. Centuries of history, authority, and moral responsibility coalesced in a single, gleaming artifact. She regarded it with reverence, aware that the crown was not merely an object, but the embodiment of duty itself. Every decision she had witnessed, every subtle act of loyalty, every instance of restraint had led to this affirmation. The crown's integrity was secure. Camilla stepped forward cautiously, her approach measured and deliberate. She did not challenge, she acknowledged. There was no public confrontation, no recrimination, only a quiet, almost imperceptible recognition that her influence had met the unyielding force of disciplined loyalty. The royal guard did not falter, and in that steadfastness, the moral center of the palace was reaffirmed. The audience could perceive the subtle yet profound resolution. Authority and tradition, though tested, had prevailed through principle, not coercion. A senior guard, standing near the edge of the hall, adjusted his stance and gave a subtle nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, both to Princess Charlotte and to the broader moral imperative that had guided their actions. Every guard understood that duty was not abstract. It was lived moment by moment, in choices that demanded courage, discernment, and restraint. The palace itself seemed to exhale, a silent witness of the resolution, its walls absorbing the lessons of loyalty, morality, and history. Camilla's gaze lingered on the young princess, and in that quiet exchange, a subtle understanding passed between them. Ambition had its place, yet it was bounded by principle. Authority carried responsibility, and the consequences of defiance were measured not in punishment alone, but in the moral clarity of those who upheld tradition. The audience could sense the emotional resonance. The palace had endured not through force, but through the disciplined fidelity of those entrusted with its care. As the evening light deepened, shadows lengthened across the hall, painting fractured patterns over marble floors and ceremonial artifacts. The royal guard performed final duties of the day with meticulous care. The straightening of banners, the alignment of ceremonial weapons, the careful folding of robes and sashes. Each act, though seemingly routine, was a reaffirmation of order, a silent demonstration that the principles of the crown had been preserved. The audience felt the rhythm of tradition, steady and unbroken, a heartbeat of continuity amid human ambition. Princess Charlotte paused near a window overlooking the palace gardens. The fading light cast a serene glow across her features, softening the sharp edges of tension that had defined the day. She allowed herself a brief reflection. The confrontation had been more than a challenge to authority. It had been a test of character, of loyalty, and of the moral fiber that bound the institution together. Every guard who had stood resolute, every subtle act of discretion, every carefully measured response had contributed to the preservation of history, heritage, and moral clarity. Camilla, retreating toward the inner chambers, carried with her the awareness that ambition without restraint could not prevail against disciplined principle. Her presence, once disruptive, was now reconciled with the enduring strength of the institution she had sought to influence. The audience understood the lesson. Authority, when exercised with fidelity to both principle and conscience, could withstand challenge without losing integrity. The final ceremonial duties of the day proceeded with solemn grace. Guards aligned in silent formation, their movements synchronized, a living embodiment of continuity and loyalty. Princess Charlotte observed, noting each detail with quiet satisfaction, aware that her leadership had been tested and that the moral center of the palace had held firm. The weight of duty was not diminished by the trials faced. Rather, it was clarified, defined, and reaffirmed through decisive, principled action. Camilla's influence, though checked, was not erased. The palace had endured a subtle recalibration, a recognition that ambition must be balanced by principle. The audience could sense the enduring lesson. Authority and loyalty coexist not through unquestioning obedience, but through the disciplined application of conscience, tradition, and moral judgment. The crown, symbol, and instrument of continuity had been preserved, yet the subtle reshaping of understanding ensured that future challenges would be met with both vigilance and discernment. As night fell, the palace settled into a reflective calm. Candles flickered in silent corridors, casting long, contemplative shadows across stone walls and polished floors. Guards patrolled with measured steps, each movement both functional and symbolic, a reminder that duty was an enduring responsibility, not a transient action. Princess Charlotte, standing in quiet observation, internalized the lessons of the day, that authority required courage, loyalty demanded discernment, and tradition endured through principled vigilance. In this serene conclusion, the audience perceived the full weight of duty. The confrontation had tested not only personal ambition, but the moral and ceremonial integrity of an institution built across centuries. Every act, every gesture, every decision had reinforced a singular truth. Loyalty, courage, and discretion were the true pillars upon which history was preserved. The palace, ancient and enduring, had witnessed another chapter, one in which principle triumphed without spectacle, and in which the subtle moral power of disciplined action reaffirmed the authority of the crown. The palace had settled into a quiet that felt sacred, almost reverent, as though the walls themselves exhaled after weeks of tension. Candles flickered softly, their glow refracting across gilded frames and ceremonial artifacts, painting the corridors in muted gold and amber. Each shadow stretched long and purposeful, a reminder that history was never truly at rest, even in moments of calm. Princess Charlotte walked slowly through these halls, her footsteps measured, echoing softly across polished marble. Her gaze lingered on the objects of tradition, the crown, ceremonial robes, and meticulously preserved relics, each one a testament to the endurance of duty and the weight of legacy. She paused near the throne, hands lightly brushing the carved wood, feeling the centuries of expectation embedded in its grain. The events of recent days, the confrontation with ambition, and the moral choices faced by the royal guard now settled within her mind. Loyalty, she realized, was not simply obedience. It was a quiet, often invisible exercise of moral discernment, a measured courage that revealed itself not in public spectacle, but in the disciplined choices made when no one watched. The audience could sense the depth of this understanding, the calm recognition that authority and history are maintained by principle, patience, and vigilance. Camilla, in her private chambers, observed the palace in reflective silence. Her ambitions, tempered now by experience and consequence, were quietly reconsidered. The confrontation had been both a test and a lesson. Authority carried not just power, but responsibility. Influence required more than clever maneuvering. It demanded respect for the moral and ceremonial fabric that bound the institution. The audience could feel the tension within her resolve, now transformed into awareness. Her presence remained, yet was subdued, reconciled with the enduring structure of tradition that would outlast personal ambition. The royal guard moved with their usual precision, yet each gesture now carried a deeper resonance. The clink of ceremonial armor, the soft alignment of polished shoes, the careful adjustment of sashes, all became quiet expressions of fidelity, discipline, and continuity. Every action reinforced the enduring lesson. Loyalty was not earned in grand acts of heroism, but in the consistent, measured upholding of principle. Each guard, aware of the subtle yet powerful impact of their choices, embodied the moral heart of the institution, a living testament to the preservation of history. Princess Charlotte approached the grand hall windows, the last light of day spilling across her features. Beyond the panes, the palace gardens glimmered in muted hues, shadows stretching across hedges and pathways. The stillness was almost tactile, a moment suspended in time, giving her the space to reflect not only on the events that had unfolded, but on the responsibilities they had revealed. The crown, the institution, and the weight of loyalty all felt alive in that quiet, golden light. The audience was invited into this contemplation, sensing a profound connection between place, duty, and moral insight. Every detail in the palace now seemed to speak. The archived letters, the ceremonial manuals, and the relics of past rulers all resonated with meaning. Each item reminded the observer that history is preserved not by chance, but by the careful, often invisible choices of those who act with conscience and courage. Princess Charlotte understood that the events she had witnessed were not isolated. They were part of a continuum, a living tradition shaped by every decision made within these walls. The audience felt the gravity of this realization. The weight of duty was both a burden and a sacred privilege, demanding respect, discernment, and integrity. Camilla, contemplating from her quiet space, considered the lessons of restraint. Her ambition, while undiminished in spirit, had encountered the enduring force of principle and loyalty. The palace had reminded her that authority and influence are bounded by the moral expectations of history, and that even subtle manipulation could not prevail over disciplined conscience. The audience sensed a subtle shift, ambition tempered by reflection, audacity softened by understanding, and the recognition that the crown's integrity required more than personal cleverness. It demanded collective fidelity and ethical judgment. Princess Charlotte turned back to the center of the hall, the crown gleaming in the soft light. She felt the weight of centuries in her hands, not literally, but through the responsibility she now understood more deeply than ever. Leadership, she reflected, was a steady exercise of moral vigilance, the continuous balancing of authority, tradition, and human complexity. The royal guard, steadfast in their roles, had illuminated this truth, proving that loyalty could withstand challenge without compromise, and that principle would always endure when discipline and conscience converged. The palace seemed to respond to the stillness. Chandeliers refracted light across polished floors, walls absorbed the quiet, and the air itself felt heavy with reflection. Every corridor, every chamber, every artifact seemed to whisper the same lesson. History is preserved not in spectacle, but in quiet integrity. Authority is upheld not through fear, but through measured courage and principled action. The audience could feel the resonance, the echo of moral clarity sustained across centuries, maintained by those willing to bear the burden of responsibility without fanfare. Camilla, observing the palace from a distance, allowed herself a moment of honest introspection. Her challenge had been met. Her strategy countered not through confrontation, but through the steadfast application of conscience. The moral lesson was clear. Ambition must coexist with integrity. Influence must respect principle, and authority is ultimately bound by ethical responsibility. The audience sensed that this reconciliation, subtle and profound, would endure far longer than the fleeting tension of confrontation. Princess Charlotte reflected on the human cost of loyalty. Every guard had demonstrated courage in quiet ways, standing firm in the face of ambiguity, resisting the subtle pressures of ambition, and preserving history through careful judgment. The crown, the institution, and the principles that underpin them were safe not because of one decisive act, but because of countless small, principled decisions made consistently, deliberately, and without expectation of recognition. The audience could feel the profound respect and reverence that flowed from these actions, the invisible yet unshakable foundation of continuity that upheld the monarchy. As night fell completely, the palace settled into serene rhythm. Candles flickered softly in their sconces, shadows danced gently across stone floors, and the air held a quiet dignity that spoke of enduring values. Princess Charlotte, standing alone for a brief moment, absorbed the lesson fully. Authority is responsibility, loyalty is action, and history is preserved through conscientious, disciplined choices. The audience could feel the lingering awe of these truths, the moral clarity illuminated not by spectacle, but by measured reflection and principled action. In the final moments, the palace seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to the completion of a moral arc. Ambition, loyalty, courage, and conscience had collided, and the outcome was both subtle and profound. The crown remained secure, tradition preserved, and the royal guard's unwavering fidelity had ensured that principle prevailed. The audience sensed the continuity of these lessons, timeless and enduring, echoing in every corridor, every ceremonial artifact, every polished surface that bore witness to history.